December 2nd. And I am gearing up because I'm going to try to do Vlogmas this year, which I could totally regret by mid-December, but I am thinking about it and I'm excited to try it and see if I like it. So as part of that, I'm going to do another deep dive vlog, and I really enjoyed that format of doing a reading vlog where I was talking about one book in depth after each section. It doesn't always work with every novel though, because you don't want to necessarily go and talk about every single chapter. But I thought maybe this guy, Russka, the novel of Russia by Edward Rutherford, would work for this. I'm reading this as part of the Reading Through the Ages book challenge. I have 2 spots left on my bingo board, Russia Before the Revolution and Australia pre-1900. So I'm going to be doing Russia Before the Revolution in November, and I'm going to be wrapping up with my last book in December. This book is a brick, officially. Sorry about the glare. This book is an official brick. It is 760 pages. And there's probably 10 or 12 sections. You get to get this very grand, sweeping look into life in places all over the world that he's written about. So this is the one I'm tackling today, or this month, and I'm going to take you on a deep dive with me. I'm going to check in after each section and let you know how it's going. And sometime in December, you'll get to see this vlog. So I am looking forward to it. I mean, this is so heavy, but we're going to make it through, and it's going to be great. So I will check in again when I've gotten through the first section of Russka. Hi everyone. Today is Wednesday, November 5th, 6th. I apologize in advance if you can hear leaf blowers, cars, children calling about video game stuff. This is life, right? Okay, so I'm checking in about Russka, the novel of Russia by Edward Rutherford. I didn't know this, but Edward Rutherford is actually his nom de plume, and I can't remember his real name, but Edward is in his real name. And his research is just so extensive. He actually wrote a little foreword at the beginning of this talking about how long he spent in Russia researching this book, talking to people, like moving around in different parts of the country. It was years. Like I think 5 years, something like that. So a long time. And I also just want to, because this is such a large book and we're doing a deep dive into it, I kind of want to just explain to you how it's structured. So it starts out with a map. So you get kind of a map of the general area where the story is taking place. And then you also have family trees, so I know that's really important to some people, especially in an epic story like this where you're going through generations and generations and skipping hundreds of years. You need a family tree. And then he goes into some details about how he researched the book, how some of the parts are real, some parts he's invented, and that he's had fact checkers go through, and if there's any errors left, it's his error. Anyway. The first part that I just finished is Forest and Steppe, which is supposed to take place in 180 AD. And a lot of this section is describing the landscape itself and how Russia was a place that didn't have a lot of self-awareness at this time. You know, he describes what's going on in Rome, he describes some other civilizations around there, and you meet 2 different groups of people. I believe one is meant to represent forest dwellers and one is and the other are meant to represent steppe dwellers and those geographical differences. So you mostly spend time, I think there's also a fly buzzing, so I apologize about that. The forest dwellers are a tribal farming culture, so they establish they have their little village established, and they grow grain, and they live off the land, and they live fairly communally in a really small way. You meet Letty, I believe is how you would say her name, and she is one wife of several wives of one of the headmen in the village, and her son Kiai, K-I-Y, and you learn about how they live day to day in the village, and that their world is very much centered around a pagan to the land existence, where they believe in the spirits of the land, the gods of the wind, the gods of the grain, and how they have to pray to those beings, how they live in a hut, and how the hut is built. And then you encounter the people of the steppe, who are referred to as horsemen, and they are more warrior-based culture, who have traveled all over and have seen many things, and they encounter the little boy when the little boy has wandered off, and potentially take the little boy, because this is kind of what their culture does. They go into villages, they raid and take the eligible men and boys, bring them with them, not to become slaves, but to become warriors in their tribe. And so it doesn't sound like the tribe focuses too much on, well, I mean, they obviously have wives and give birth to boys who they will then train into becoming these warriors, but they don't rely on that solely, because as we know, death rates were very high for children in these days, and you can give birth to several sons and then they die, or you can just only have daughters being born and then you don't have any warriors. So they would go into other villages to take the men, and they would become warriors in this culture, and they consider themselves to be very well traveled and very just garnering a level of experience that is more sophisticated than the forest dwellers. And so that's the first 34 pages of the book, and you learn about these two cultures. And so those two ancestors are established. That will be the beginning of the lineage for the rest of the people in the rest of the book. So I will check in again once I have gotten through the next section.
Message to the Ukrainians and the Russians: we send with the decision on security assistance is key.
Hello. I am checking in after reading the second section of Russka, which is called The River. And this section covers from about a lifetime of one person living from 1066, I think, so it's right when that red comet was over the sky in all of Europe, and it's been recorded many times. You start off with Ivan, who is young. He's 12 years old, and he's hoping to become a warrior, and he's the third son in the family, and he's part of the very complicated lineage of princes that were ruling over the area of Russia at that time. So it's a very complicated system, but as far as I can understand, the systems of lineage were passed from brother to brother and not from father to son. And so there were many different princes all over the land, and Ivan's father, Igor, and his older brothers were already serving princes, and so it seems like the aristocracy would give their lineage, their loyalty, to these different princes coming from different areas. And obviously some of them had different like different origins as well. So some are more from Poland, some are more from Hungary. Like there were just all these different types of people living in Russia at the time. There's also different sects of Christianity, so the Greek or the Roman sects, and I don't think Russia had really created their own version of those religions yet. There's also a Jewish family and a Jewish character, but he was much more minor in the story. And then there's also a descendant of the first family that we meet in the story, who would have been Kia's son, descendant, Shek, I think he's called. And then Ivan is supposed to be a descendant of the Allen horsemen that we met in the first section. So we're very loosely connected to them. There's no direct lineage that we know of, but that's how you know whose families they're from. What I got from that section was really that there was a lot of different factions that were leading up to the first revolution of the peasant class, where they were feeling that the aristocracy was not ruling well. There were a lot of cartels. There was kind of this greedy capitalism that wasn't being kept in check, and there was no main ruler who was keeping control of the laws and making it more fair for everyone. And so by the end of this section, there is a ruler who comes in, and that is a ruler who Ivan has been following and has been loyal to. So that's where the second section ends, and we are going on into a section called the Tatar. And so I will check in again when we get through that one. Hello everybody. Okay, I wanted to check in today. I have finished section 3 and 4, or I guess they're chapters, and section 3 was quite a long one. It was called the Tatar. I don't know if it's Tatar or Tatar, and it begins in 1237, and it ends around 1263. We follow mostly Yanka, who is a peasant girl, and this is the time period in Russia where the Mongolians began their conquest of the area. So not Genghis Khan, but his descendants were going into Russia. And I enjoyed this section on a lot of levels. It's nice to learn about things from a peasant's perspective instead of just from, the more elitist, rich members of society, as we did in the first section. And Yanka is a young girl. Her mother is murdered by the invasion. The Tatars is apparently what the Russians called the Mongolian fleets. And then it's just her and her father and her brother, and then her brother is taken away as well and brought to another part of the empire to be a carpenter. And so it's just the father and daughter. And they go to settle a smaller settlement where they will be further away from these invaders. And that's where this section gets a little bit difficult in subject matter. There's a couple things that are problematic in this section. One of them is incest, and how it's handled is the problem with dealing with a big issue like that in a book like this, which is like an overview. I mean, it's a huge book. There's a lot of space in here, but you're still not getting complete character development. You're getting snippets of time in people's lives. And I think when you're dealing with something as big as incest, and I think in some ways he handled it okay, but in other ways it was not satisfying to me. And, you know, it just, I know it's a different time period, obviously, and he took creative license with it, and I just don't think it was necessarily successful. And then later on in Yenka's story, she grows up, she gets away from her father, and she does that through the means that most women have, which is through making herself a sexual object. And then she gets pregnant and has an abortion. And I was also questioning the way her abortion was handled in the book, because it didn't seem to me to correspond well to the understanding that I have of the way abortions were performed historically. It just seemed like something supernatural, and it didn't really feel real. And I think women who who undertook something like this did it with much more trepidation, especially when they were highly religious, as this girl is supposed to be. So overall, the section was interesting, but it does go into those types of realities. So that's where I am with that. And then the next chapter, chapter 4, was very, very short. It was titled The Icon. And basically what is happening here is that there is a monastery built in the settlement, and the monastery plays into the next several sections, I believe. So this is, you know, you're establishing, this is 1454, so we jumped ahead again, and descendants of Yenka are staffing this monastery. Okay, so I just completed the section in Russka called Ivan, and it details the reign of Ivan the Terrible. And we follow Boris, who is the descendant of the Allens family, who marries Elena. But he also forms this bond with Ivan the Tsar, and so he really is more of a military man, he really looks to Ivan with this sense of wonder. And even as Ivan is descending into, I mean, what anyone would consider to be mental illness, where he is becoming religiously fanatical, killing people because of a whims, of suspicions, believing that gemstones, you know, have powers. Just Boris is still wrapped up in Ivan's spell. And you also get into a little bit of the church. So there's a monastery in the village of Russka, and Stephen is a priest, Daniel is a monk, and Mikhail is a peasant. And all of these characters are descendants of the other family, the Slavic family, and they all suffer various fates that are dictated by Ivan. So yeah, this section was okay. I would say that in the middle it kind of dragged a bit, and so I lost interest in reading, but it really picked up near the end of the section. And this is where I've read to, so still not even halfway, and we're over halfway through November, so I don't think I'm going to get this done in November. Good morning, everyone. I'm updating you on Russka. I just finished the section called The Cossack, which begins in 1647 and ends around 16 49, I think, is the last update of year that we get. So this section, 1653. So this section covers kind of the political aspect of the Cossacks and the fact that they were a group of Slavic descendants that craved freedom and were trying to get away from the power of the Tsar. So I believe the Cossacks mostly were living in Ukraine. And so we follow a descendant of one of the main bloodlines who runs away from being a peasant and goes to be free, and ends up, his descendants become Cossacks and fight and live in this kind of free way. And you're seeing things through the eyes of Andrei, who or Andrei, I don't remember exactly how you pronounce his name. And he is trying to come to terms with the way he grew up, but there's all these, Andrei, yeah. There's all these controlling classes. So the Polish noble class, who are also using the Jewish class, Jewish people, to control lands that are supposed to be freehold lands, but they're given out in these long leases of time, and then all of a sudden someone comes and tells you that it's time for you to give it back. And so it's really interesting. It's such a complex system, and the actual system itself is not as interesting to me, but understanding the structure of the Orthodox Church and of the Tsar, and how the Tsar used his power, and how everything was structured in Russia, and how that related to how it was structured in Ukraine at the time, was interesting. And it's also interesting because right now, of course, in the US, there's the impeachment hearings going on concerning President Trump, and they're talking about the Ukraine, and they're talking about Kiev, and they're talking about all these things. So it's kind of interesting to be reading this at this juncture in time as well. There's also a woman's perspective in this, and she is a peasant. And so you see how peasants were basically slaves. You see that they had no freedom to move. They had no freedom to control their lives. They basically were there to work and give their money to the boyars, the higher class, whoever owned their land. They had no power. They had no agency. And the young man who's the Cossack in this story sees that. He sees the lack of power, and he reflects on it, but knows that he's privileged and he can't really do much about it in his privileged position. About 43% through. This is a very long book, so we still have lots of sections left. Going to continue on, and I will check in again after the next section. Hi everyone, how are ya? It is Wednesday, November 26th, I think. And you may notice a difference in this video from the previous ones, and that's because I just got a new phone, so the camera is just a better quality camera. So I'm checking in today with Russka, the novel of Russia. And I have just finished the Peter section, Peter the Great, obviously. And Peter the Great. So this starts in the year, let me find the year. Oh, here we go. Around 1670. So what I think Edward Rutherford did in this section was he was able to really reiterate, like really make me understand how deeply religion is ingrained in Russian society. So I can't go into all the specifics because it is very, very convoluted. But what Peter the Great did was he tried to make Russia a secular society because he was, I guess, not inclined himself towards religion, which caused huge turmoil in the country and so many sects. We follow the Raskolniki. Oh, I think that's what they're called. Who were a specific sect of the Russian Orthodox Church that broke away from the others because of some reforms that were brought in earlier than that. And they ended up meeting in secret and having, I mean, in a lot of ways, it's a very cult-like society. I mean, they would rather die than be apprehended for diverging from the religion. They also believed Peter the Great was the Antichrist. So, you know, it's very extreme in terms of how they dealt with their religion and with their belief system and with their distrust of Peter as a czar and what he was doing to the country of Russia. Obviously, he was the one who established St. Petersburg. So you see the beginning of the establishment of St. Petersburg near the end of this section. Peter traveled to Western Europe. He was very fond of German culture. It seems like his reign, there was just wars constantly. There was just warring all the time to try to get more lands, to try to establish St. Petersburg on the edge of the Baltic Sea. So there's a lot happening in this section, and it was interesting because there were things like the Raskolniki all wore beards and they wore traditional Russian clothing. And Peter was like, nope, you're going to shave your beards, or you can pay a beard tax and then wear a necklace to say that you've paid the tax. And you also, and by the end of his reign, he was also saying you can't wear those traditional Russian garments anymore. You have to dress like Western Europeans. Like he was also craving knowledge of navigation, mathematics. He was trying to take Russia, because another thing I didn't really think about too much in terms of Russia is how isolated they are. They're very landlocked in this section of the world that doesn't have a lot of people coming in, certainly not the way a place like England would. And so they were very limited into what sort of information they learned from travelers and how information was brought to them. And in the Cossack section, you see how they would accept small doses of this knowledge, but they were very suspect of it. Whereas Peter was like, no, we're going to this is good. Like, we need ships. We need to conquer. We need to move out into the world, and we need to learn all these things. And it was just really hard for the peasants and the artisan classes to accept his way of looking at the world, because it was so different than anything they'd had before. So a lot happened in this chapter, and I am 53% through this baby, so getting there. Hi everyone. Next check-in for Russka. Just finished the section on Catherine the Great, and I have to say that this one was structured differently than the others, and I'm not sure if I liked the change in structure or not, but it was just focusing on one character the entire section. He was the main protagonist through the whole thing, so you really follow mostly his life. and how it was affected by the court of Catherine. And it was very interesting to learn about Catherine, the things that she did. She took away a lot of the property of the church and made it state land. She conquered more places, and she was this very empowered Tsarina who was having lots of affairs with different men, and the men who were having affairs with her were like able to be ambitious and decide, you know, make big decisions for her and have a lot of power in the court. Alexander Bobrov, who we follow, is kind of a lesser noble, and we follow his decisions whether or not to marry, whether or not to he was trying at one point to become Catherine's next lover, and how fate kind of played with him. And we also explore the status of the Freemasons as a secret society in St. Petersburg. So we're mostly in St. Petersburg the entire time. And the next section is called The Duel. Funny little thing happened. I wanted to renew this at the library, and someone has it on hold and is waiting for it, which made me kind of annoyed because, I mean, this is a pretty obscure book from 1991, yet someone else wants to read it. So I now have to get through these pages as quickly as possible because each day I am being fined for not returning this to the library, and I really wanted to get it done. So I'm going to try to bust this book out in this week and read it as quickly as I can. Good morning, everybody. I am a bit of a hot mess today. I have a cold. I just had to go drop off my younger son, Elliot, at a field trip at the university that is up on top of the mountain that we live on, and it is a super confusing place to drive, and it's super foggy this morning. So I just drove around in circles for about 15 minutes until I found where we were supposed to be, dropped him off, and I'm here now. I'm gonna have some tea, and then in an hour and a half, I have to go and pick them up there. So I'm super excited to go back into that fog. That was super fun, especially when you're driving other people's children as well. Okay, so I'm actually here to talk to you about Russka, the novel of Russia. I just finished the section called The Duel last night. I still am enjoying it. I don't really understand why Edward Rutherford made the decisions he made in these last two sections. Catherine and The Duel have basically focused on one family the whole time. And a few of the people who have been, whose other families who have had descendants have shown up as kind of smaller pieces of the puzzle. But you're really focusing on these two families. So in a way, it's almost like a separate novel, and I feel like he went off on a few tangents that weren't necessary. So in this section, we are going through a lot of the changing of the czars. So Catherine's son, and then Catherine the Great's grandson, and still a lot of talk about the serfs and freeing the serfs, and then right at the end of this section is when the czar decides to free the serfs. And then a lot of like romanticism. He focused a bit in this section on the development of literature, so how the aristocrats and noble classes would read German, French, mostly literature, and that they didn't have a literary history. They had no big literature creators until this period, so post Catherine. So that was interesting. Hi everybody, getting down to the wire with Russka. I just finished Fathers and Sons last night, and I have about 100 pages of the section called Revolution and then the epilogue. Fathers and Sons seem to have a really specific mission in mind as a section. Its mission was to establish the division between the generations as the seeds of the revolution were being planted. And I think, obviously, seeds of revolution were being planted in Russia long before this time period. It's about 1874. And what's happening here is there's a division between the classes are obviously getting more, so the impoverished serfs are becoming more impoverished. The kind of educated serfs that were able to create jobs for themselves are getting richer, and the noble class who own the land are not really rich. Well, they are rich compared to the serfs, but they struggle to maintain the old order, the old way of things, which isn't really working now because the serfs have technically been freed, but they're still, they're not empowered. They're not able to really advance. It's very, very hard. And what's happening is there's a lot of factories, and a lot of the serfs who were owned by families and worked for families are just put out into the world with nowhere to live and nothing to do. And so they go and work in these factories and live in basically boarding houses at the factories. And while the conditions might be not horrible, as they weren't in Russka in the story, they were still not in any way empowering, or there was no way for the serfs to really feel like they were getting anywhere. So by the end of the section, you have the generations who are divided. You have the younger generation preparing to gather fodder and gather people in the revolution, and they're trying to get their message across that it doesn't have to be this way. We can take the land back, and we will do it with violence if necessary. So we all know what comes next, and I'm going to dive into that section tonight and try to get through as much as I can tonight, as much as I can tomorrow night, and then wrap this up on Saturday. So talk to you again soon. Hi everyone. I finished Russka this morning, and I gave it 4 stars. I thought it was very well executed. I particularly liked the last section, the section Revolution. So there were 3 more sections that I hadn't talked to you about: Revolution, Coda, and Epilogue. Coda and Epilogue were very short, just like 5 to 10 pages each. And but Revolution was a really long section that covered the kind of scope of the revolutionary times when the Soviets took over, the death of the Tsar, although they don't go into the murder of the Tsar very much, because it's really more about other people in Russia and how they fared under the new regime. And I loved what he did with Revolution. It was my favorite section, and I wish that he would have done similar themes in the other sections, because he really focused on diversity in Revolution, and he showed us the perspective of a Jewish person, the Jewish perspective in Russia in terms of what was happening to them throughout Russian history. So it almost could have been its own separate novel, just what the Jewish people endured in Russia under the Tsar, under like a very strict Orthodox majority. And then he also put in a bit of gay representation, which I thought was great, because that's the type of diversity that we need in historical works as well, because gay people have always been there. They've always existed. They've always been part of society. Yes, they were mostly in hiding or persecuted, and we need to hear those stories as well in historical context and put them into the broader spectrum of society, because we're all part of society. So I was really glad that he included it. It was a very small section. Could have been more. It could have been a larger part, and I think it would have really enriched the story. But the fact that it was included at all, I think, was very good. So, yeah, I enjoyed that book, and I'm gonna take it back to the library, and that will end my deep dive into Russka by Edward Rutherford. So, if you've ever been curious about his books, how they work, their structure, and what he does with them, I hope this vlog helped you to see that. And I will be back again soon with another video.